Daniel Drezner, thanks so much for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on such a slow week.
Exactly.
Really, exactly. So we have christened this, or the administration has christened this military operation Epic Fury.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you make of Epic Fury so far, Daniel Drezner?
It is a replay of what we saw in Venezuela, which is to credit the U.S. military and U.S. intelligence. The initial 24 hours were pretty successful if the goal was a decapitation strike. It looks like the CIA had good intel on where the Ayatollah Khamenei and his elite were. They took out a fair number of leaders. But that is the moment where this separates very wildly from what Venezuela was. In the case of the Venezuela operation, the idea was to remove Nicolas Maduro and his wife, and otherwise the regime has pretty much stayed in place. And the U.S. has tried to coerce them into doing what it wants. The goal here is much more nebulous. As the clip you played suggested, it sounds like Trump wants regime change when he talks. If you hear Pete Hegseth or you hear others speak, it is far from clear that is what they want. And the other problem is that this is a regime that has been more heavily institutionalized than the Maduro regime in Venezuela. And they've been prepared for this for months/years/decades. So the very fact that you've seen, retaliatory strikes by Iran already, the fact that this war has already started to widen to include Israeli strikes against Hezbollah and vice versa, demonstrates that I don't know if the Trump administration actually has a strategy for how this ends. They have some good tactics in the first 24 hours, but I don't know what their end goal is.
Well, maybe that is where I'm going. Forget how it ends. Why are they there to begin with? And this is not just my usual Trump cynicism. As you mentioned, he was against regime change for ages. Mm-hmm. Then he's for regime change on the weekend. Mm-hmm. Pete Hegseth at 8 o'clock this morning said it's not about regime change, even though the regime will change. He had a clever turn of phrase. Why are they doing this?
This is where, getting into the brain of Donald Trump is a torturous exercise, to say the least. What I would suggest is going on is, first of all, Trump's been on a lucky streak when it comes to the use of force, right? I mean, this is the 9th time I think he's used the military since his second inauguration.
He's bombed 7 countries, yes, from what I know. Yeah. Nigeria, Somalia, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Venezuela, and I forgot the 7th, but go ahead.
Most of these attacks, either in some cases have been ineffectual, in other cases have been effectual, but he hasn't suffered any negative blowback from this. So think about the June airstrikes against Iran, which, according to most analysts, at least set back Iran's nuclear program, even though obviously it didn't obliterate it, otherwise we wouldn't be having this bombing.
And obliterate was Trump's word.
Yeah. Allegedly obliterating a second time.
Yes.
Okay.
But also the Venezuela operation, I think you can argue from Trump's perspective, ended better than – it was a risky operation, but it worked in the sense of they managed to get Maduro without any loss of U.S. life. Think of Trump as a gambler where he keeps betting on red and he keeps getting red. He keeps doubling down as a result. The other reason I have to think is that he's listening to, his advisors to some extent. I don't know what the policymaking process is at this point, but the one sort of through line of someone like, let's say, Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth is the unconstrained exercise of American power. And certainly this is something that is happening here. The third, I just realized there's a third component here, which is Israel, which is the degree to which Benjamin Netanyahu wants to launch this attack and potentially wrong foot or force Donald Trump to go along might be something else that's going on here. That is speculation.
Can I add a fourth and
Sure.
Be nice to me, okay, if you will, because you're the professional and Margie and I are amateurs at best on this thing. I am of the belief that at least a factor, if not the only factor, is Epstein diversion. Is that? Do you reject that out of hand as a serious foreign policy person?
I don't reject it out of hand just because I keep seeing everyone saying that. So it's a possibility. But if you're going to engage in diversionary war, this is the dumbest diversionary war to engage in because you are opening up a whole can of worms. You are risking stability, even if this generates the short-term sugar high, which, by the way, the polling suggests it's not going to.
Have we seen any polling after?
There's been polling. Reuters Ipsos had a poll, and I believe YouGov had a poll.
What did they say?
Both showed pluralities opposing what the U.S. has done and arguing that Trump has not gone about this the right way. And part of the thing that we need to realize is that compared to, let's say, the U.S. invasion of Iraq or the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan or even the U.S. operations in Libya in 2011, none of which ended terribly well, but you can at least argue the process was such that the presidents in each of these three cases made the case to Congress, made the case to the American people. This has been an odder arrangement whereby there's been a lot of reporting about the buildup of military force, but as you pointed out, the moment Trump starts speaking, that's his first public appearance since the bombing, the war, in his words, started 48 hours ago.
He thought it was appropriate to do an Oval Office address after the death of Charlie Kirk, but did not think it was appropriate or necessary to do an Oval Office address to the American people about essentially declaring war in Iran. We're speaking to Daniel Drezner from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts.
We also have the Rachel Maddow theory from MS, who thinks that part of this could be that he's pleasing the people in the Arab states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc., where his family is making billions and billions of dollars, and they are not fans of Iran, and that he got pushed by Netanyahu and is also pleasing those people in terms of his business arrangements.
I don't doubt that he got pushed by Netanyahu. If he got pushed by his Gulf allies, and the Gulf allies have been playing the most brilliant diplomatic double game I've seen, because it's been very clear. I was in the region actually at the end of January, and a lot of the reporting shows none of the Gulf states really wanted this kind of escalation. It's not that they have any love for the Iranian regime. Right. You're absolutely right about that. Perspective all along has been that they prefer the weakened devil they know to the uncertain devil that they don't.
That might take over.
Okay. And indeed, it's worth noting that the CIA, when conducting analysis of what would happen if they toppled Khamenei, actually predicted that a hardliner from the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps would likely take over. In other words, you would actually have a worse situation potentially. And when I was there were a lot of very skittish folks who didn't want to see this kind of escalation. And indeed, how it's played out is exactly why they were so skittish. I'm sure you've seen video of the Dubai airport being hit, of five-star resorts and hotels in Dubai being hit, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar. The Gulf is actually a booming region economically and financially. They want to establish themselves as a sort of hub in terms of transport, in terms of finance, and so forth. It is hard to do that when you have Iranian missiles raining down on you. And they're admittedly, the damage has not been extensive, but all you need is just a couple of these. And also the fact that at this point, no one can fly out of the region unless they go through Riyadh. That is a huge blow to their reputation of being an oasis of stability in a sea of instability.
We're talking to Daniel Drezner. And
so we'll dismiss that one then.
I just don't think it holds up.
Just so you all know, we are waiting for Donald Trump to speak at a Medal of Honor ceremony at the White House. And when he does, we'll take a piece of that if he addresses the situation in Iran. And after that and our conversation with Dan Drezner, we will take your calls. You've mentioned Venezuela a couple times. We were obsessed with Greenland for a week, and then it was totally dropped, even though he came back from that conference in Europe and said, everything's great, we have a great deal in the works. Of course, never hear from it again. We, as to use your term, decapitate the leader of Venezuela. His vice president takes over. Essentially never hear, maybe you hear about it, the American people, we don't hear about that again. It seems to me that it's a lot harder to just disappear from this, a la Venezuela. And so... Yes, meaning what has to happen?
I mean, there is always the possibility that Trump just says, mission accomplished, we're done, we've sufficiently debilitated the regime such that we don't have to worry about it. And in some ways, that I think is the Netanyahu approach to this. There's a phrase that Netanyahu often has used in terms of dealing with Hamas and with Palestinian extremists called mowing the lawn, which is the idea is that periodically he decides to bomb Gaza or what have you with the idea that it degrades their capabilities for a short time, and then after they grow their capabilities back, he bombs again. There's a way in which this is an internationalized version of this, of just taking out Iran's capabilities first in June, or and also prior to that, and now doing it again, and maybe 6 months from now we engage in another bombing episode. The problem this time, as you say, is that it's going to be tougher to just sort of walk away, because in part that requires Iran to also agree, okay, we're fine with not launching any more ballistic missiles. You've already seen oil prices start to spike. You've seen stocks start to drop. Gold prices are soaring. Now, these are all short-term effects. The question is, if it seems like the war is going to continue, and Trump, I believe, in an interview with the New York Times last night said something like 4 to 5 weeks. 4 to 5 weeks is not going to be great. And it also raises the question of what Iran's asymmetric response will be, not just in the region, but frankly in this country.
Whoa, frankly in this country, what do you mean by that?
Iran, the one thing I will agree with Donald Trump about is that Iran is a state sponsor of terrorism. If you've got a country that is bombing you unrelentingly for a couple of weeks, you don't think there's going to be efforts to try to foment some kind of terrorist response in the United States?
I see.
Oh, good. So let's talk about the Iranian people for a minute, because many thousands cheering in the streets. I read where something like 80% of the people there want a regime change. But that, as you said before, it's a very institutionalized operation. So even though we took out this horrible Ayatollah and many people underneath him, that there are layers underneath that ready to take over. And the security forces who've slaughtered all these protesters, they're still in charge too. So how do the Iranian people take charge, as Trump has urged them to do?
I don't think they do. I mean, unless you really have some sort of, just spontaneous uprising. But bear in mind, that's what happened in December and January. And the response by the regime was to slaughter tens and thousands of people. So, first of all, you're not going to have people in the streets while there are bombs raining down. There's a general rule that's a really dumb idea. Second, historically, coercive bombing tends not to lead to spontaneous uprisings against a regime, historically. If you take a look at sort of past evidence. And the few times that it has, it's often ended horribly. The best example of the parallel to this would be, I suppose, the 91 Gulf War, when after Iraq lost that, and George H.W. Bush called on Iraqis to rise up, you had open revolt in 17 of 18 of Iraq's provinces. And the problem was that the Bush administration didn't want actual regime change. They didn't want the Shias and or the Kurds to be running things. So they stood aside while Saddam Hussein's forces really ruthlessly mowed down the population. And everything from Trump so far suggests it's not that he actually wants regime change. He just wants a new leader in there who, and I apologize for the language here, isn't someone else's SOB, it's our SOB.
And the likelihood that the third or fourth tier down are SOBs seems high.
Oh,
there's SOBs all the way down in Iran. Yes.
But SOBs who might be willing to cut a deal, I assume, because at the same time that he was talking about regime change, he being Trump, said he's also willing to negotiate a deal. And so would they be willing to negotiate a deal? And
what deal?
Was the Curry deal one and done?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, you would think that there might be some incentive for a particularly ambitious third-tier person to think, okay, maybe I'm the one who can cut the deal with the United States and take over. But again, this is where Iran is not Venezuela, which is the sort of ideology of the revolutionary regime in Iran post-1979 means that I think the only folks who are left there, who are particularly in the top tiers, are, there's a lot of zealots, and maybe there are a few. You need someone who is sufficiently corrupt to not really be a true believer. And I don't know if the person who's corrupt would also be competent enough to actually withstand any sort of assaults from anyone else if he was accused of sort of appeasing the United States.
You mentioned in passing the economic impact here, and generally what, at least in my analysis from afar, arm's length, is when Trump makes a dramatic change in policy, it often is because of the economic consequences of thing.
Yep.
So if not only is the oil not making it through, but liquefied natural gas, I heard, 20% of the world's supply goes through the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah.
Does that have potential to rise to a level that could cause Trump to back off sooner rather than later?
It does, but part of the problem is that Trump is keenly aware of his reputation, and he doesn't like it. You're correct that the two times Trump has backed down in terms of coercive threats over the last year was right after the Liberation Day tariffs and then the Greenland business, where the bond markets freaked out the first time and then the stock market freaked out the second time, and he walked back. The problem is that we all know this now, and it's consistent with how he behaved during his first term, and I think he's been trying to bury that sort of taco, Trump always chickens out reputation. And I suppose you could argue this ongoing war would potentially do that. And maybe what he thinks is that he can just sort of tough it out for a while.
I don't know if this is your area of expertise, but I in the many times I've been wrong, which is almost every prediction I've ever made about Trump, I assume...
Oh, Jim, there's no way you've been more wrong than I have. I beg to differ on that.
Once he disparaged Khizr Khan, who we've had on the show and was one of the most impressive people we've ever had on the show. And Khizr Khan and his wife, you remember, he addressed the Democratic National Convention with his son was killed, I think in Iraq. Am I right about that? And he had pulled the Constitution out of his pocket, and Trump, of course, trashed them. And when he said what he said about John McCain, here's where I was wrong. There's no veterans ever going to support this guy again. And of course, that doesn't happen. When he comes back, refuses to make himself available to explain why we have dropped bombs on another country and declared war, his own words, but refuses to even comment on what was then 3 American troops who'd been lost. It's now up to 4. And the only comment he makes when he returns to the White House, when the reporters are yelling out questions, do you have any comments for the families of the 3 people? He talks about 2 new statues or something that have been built. Not one damn comment until Hegseth this morning made comments. But again, that was not Trump himself. Does that poison elements of the military who would otherwise be open to Trump's leadership, or am I grasping at you-know-whats?
I think you're grasping a little bit.
Okay.
I understand why you're saying this, but we're on year 10 now of Trump
that's a good point.
Disrespecting the military. Now, the one way in which this might be a different thing is that in contrast to all the previous times where it's just been rhetoric, Trump has now put U.S. soldiers in harm's way. He's put a lot of U.S. forces in harm's way. And while, yes, there's been some tactical successes, most of the officer corps, and I think, frankly, a lot of the enlisted folks are going to recognize it's not clear what the end game is here. And so that might be something where there is at least a slice of the sort of support for Trump that might begin to doubt what he's doing here, because again, we've now come full circle. Trump, in articulating what he's been doing on Iran, sounds more neoconservative than the most neoconservative did back 20 years ago.
Can we talk a little bit more about Iran just for a second? I mean, we all know this Ayatollah was very brutal. Many remember that 22-year-old who was stopped in the street, the young woman, for not having her hair covered the right way, ended up dying in prison. There were all these protests. But you touch on the corruption, too. Besides the brutality of the regime, talk about the corruption over there. What does that entail?
Well, I mean, I think there's a Carnegie Endowment for National Peace scholar, Karim Sajapur, and I'm probably mangling his last name, and I apologize for that, but wrote a great sort of obituary for the Ayatollah Khamenei, and pointing out that he actually was not terribly charismatic figure, and sort of made a corrupt bargain with the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps, where they were sort of given control over the economy in return for him maintaining, support of and maintaining power. The result is that Iran's economy has been a basket case for a whole variety of things. And one of the things about economies under sanction is sanctions automatically breed corruption, because what you then try to do is create black market and gray market means of violating the sanctions. And the Guard Corps, the IRGC, now controls an awful lot of the sort of main elements of the Iranian economy, and they've gotten rich off of sanctions evasion and a variety of corrupt dealings, including, by the way, arms exports. So part of the problem here is that they don't want to give up power either, because they don't want to give up their money.
So, and that's another problem for the regular Jane and Joe rising to the fore and rebelling.
Yes. I mean, it's worth pointing out that last December and January is hardly the first time the Iranian people have actually taken to the streets.
They've been very courageous.
It's been there's been protests, I think, every 2 years or something along those lines, going back at least to 2009 in the Green Revolution. But this regime has also made it extremely clear that they don't care about that. They are willing to slaughter people in the streets if it means maintaining power. And January, and I suspect they're actually not going to have to do that, at least in the short term, because, again, people don't go out in the streets when there are bombs falling.
So we only have a minute left, and then we're going to take your calls, and at some point we may take a piece of Donald Trump. The Medal of Honor ceremony hasn't started on time. I don't want you to leave here and say, I can't believe they didn't ask me this. Is there some element of this Iran story that we are missing?
That's a great question. The thing I think that is missing a little bit This is now the third actor that was a Russian ally or a Russian proxy that is now being severely debilitated by U.S. force. Go back to Assad's fall at the end of 2024. Then Venezuela, Maduro was an ally of Putin, and now we have Iran. And this, I think, is one of the grand ironies about what the Trump administration is doing. Whenever you ask them about, the Russian-Ukrainian war, they make it clear they want to end the war, and they seem perfectly comfortable with ending the war on Russia's terms. The odd thing is that everything else they are trying to do, I think they are in part able to do because Russia is preoccupied with Ukraine and not able to either send material or diplomatic weights to support their proxies.